Let's get to our big take here this morning. China has managed to achieve a leadership position in several key technology industries, including the likes of EVs and renewable energy. And that is despite U.S. efforts to slow those advances, especially in areas that threaten military superiority. That is the topic of today's big take. And for more, we have a team on board here from our Asia government and economy correspondent, Rebecca Chung-Wilkins, also Bloomberg Intelligence senior analyst, Robert Lee. Rebecca, I'll start with you. Key question, has the U.S. failed to contain China?
Well, it sort of somewhat depends on what areas of technology you're talking about, but by and large, we can answer no. So if we look at these 13 key technologies under China's own Made in China 2025 goals, so that's the industrial policy that President Xi Jinping laid out back in 2015. 5 of these key sectors are global leaders, 7 of them are catching up fast, and 1 is a laggard. Now, the big exception to that is probably semiconductors, particularly these really advanced chips where export controls and moves to try and prevent the transfer of US technology have been relatively successful. In part, though, because China was already some ways behind. And of course, the other element here is that all of these restrictions have incited China to pour billions and billions into trying to accelerate the indigenization, the localization of that chip industry.
And, Robert, that takes us very nicely into your wheelhouse here. Here are the 13 technologies. China's top of the world in 5. They're competitive in 7. They're laggard in 1. Talk to us a little bit more about chips.
Okay, on the semiconductor front, there's always a focus on the leading edge, the bleeding edge, the high-end processors, the NVIDIA-like products, etc., which is important. But I think we shouldn't forget the mass market, because the majority of chips sold in the world go into fairly mundane from articles from air conditioners to automobiles to toasters to kettles, you name it. And that is a massive market. And as you appreciate, China is the workshop to the world. So I think, the focus of what China is doing strategically at the moment is to build self-sufficiency within those mass markets where it can still make a good profit. Maybe the margin is not quite as high at the bleeding edge, but I think that potentially gives the country a good foundation. And this is a generic Asian model. If you look at the Japanese car industry or the Japanese the motorbike industry, they did the same thing. They competed at the low end, built critical mass, and then used that as a platform to move upscale. So I think that's what China's doing. And the way things are going at the moment, it's steady as she goes. It's a long-term, maybe multi-decade ambition or plan, but it's making very good progress.
What about the AI front in terms of who's outperforming right now in terms of using these sort of Chinese-made chips?
Yeah, I mean, with AI, you can divide it into hardware and software, and clearly the States, NVIDIA, is leading on that front for the AI accelerators. And obviously, given the export controls, there were concerns earlier in the year that the restricted access to these AI accelerators would curtail China's access. But what has happened, obviously, given that challenge, that has spurred Chinese companies and the government, or supported by the government, to double down their efforts. And so what they've done is move to sort of more focused, more computationally or less computationally intensive models that can work more easily and more effectively using the lower-end domestic chips. That's enabled them to continue their developments at a fairly rapid rate. So I would say China is firmly positioned now as the global number 2 in software, and that's confirmed by third-party evidence from US or European sources, because the technical barrier to entry on the software side is substantially lower than on semiconductors. Again, I don't want to trivialize it, but it is far easier to train a developer to code than it is to deliver chips at the atomic scale. So I think, again, China's doing extremely well on the AI front, although the US is likely to remain the leader, for certainly over the next few years or so.
Yeah, and how far behind is China as a number 2, right? Because let's go back to the bleeding edge, right? So like a chip design, how far behind is China in years, and how far behind is China from having its own TSMC? How far behind is SMIC from TSMC?
Yes, so on the foundry side, SMIC and Huahong, and there are some others are the equivalent foundries. So they're, how far are they behind? The big roadblock for them, or bottleneck, is the access to bleeding edge ASML EUV equipment. So obviously, given the export restrictions, they can't access that. They are several generations behind. But again, with the support of the state behind them. And again, China has an enormous number of engineers at its disposal. I think over time, and with the support of the government, they can narrow the gap. But they are 5-10 years behind. It's quite difficult to put a firm number on it.
When it comes to this U.S. election, I mean, we've always long talked about China. I guess they don't care as much who wins as president because, either way, there's still that tariff risk. But how do you see this faring out, Trump versus Harris?
I think both scenarios are bad news for China, but they do present quite different sort of approaches. So if we think about Trump, of course, we've had this 60% figure bandied day in, day out. And of course, that would be a significant hit to the Chinese economy. They have figured out other ways. We look at transshipment, this idea that trade always does find a way to get through. But Kamala Harris has taken quite a different approach. She's focused more on export controls and the national security elements around that. Of course, we expect her to be more of a status quo figure. She has said that, if we saw something like a 60% tariff on all Chinese imports, that would effectively be a tax on the middle class. So two quite different approaches here when it comes to China.
Concerns over, I'm not sure how to phrase this, potential war, potential conflict playing into, these bilateral ties.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, this has become an increasingly explicit part of the discussion when it comes to the US-China rivalry. It sort of used to be in the background somewhat. It's become much more focused and much more explicit. So Jake Sullivan in 2022 talking explicitly about the use of export controls as a tool to degrade military battlefields. And we know Beijing officials, in addition to sort of seeing things like lithium and solar panels as a key part of the new drivers of growth and so on, it's also a security element. It's also about ensuring and improving China's self-sufficiency when it comes to energy in any potential sort of war scenario where we saw other countries trying to sort of restrict or sanction or limit its access to oil and gas.